Now, I absolutely love Magic Legacy. I love digging through old cards, finding these obscure old mechanics, and building these really wondrous, weird decks. But I've always kind of wondered, why is there no deck that allows me to build, say, an unstoppable killing police robot that is also on some level a metaphor for the violence inherent in pop culture in the 80s? If there was such a deck, I would certainly buy it for $1. Anyway, I think you see where I'm going with this. Today, we are going to be building a deck that allows you to sort of role play as an omni-consumer products executive. And in essence, what you're going to be doing is this. Get it? You're summoning a RoboCop from your deck. Now, there's a couple key mechanics to the RoboCop deck. Chief among them is something I'm calling the RoboCop mechanic. Essentially, you're going to be summoning lots of pieces of equipment that grant lots of huge buffs, like hexproof and vigilance, and you're going to pair them with things like enchantments, which grant indestructibility and give you also temporary buffs and all sorts of things. I chose white for this deck because I think that one of the keys to RoboCop is taking an ordinary plain old law enforcement soldier and then using equipment to buff him into something unstoppable. And white tends to have a lot of very unassuming white soldier creatures. The other nice thing about white is it has two mechanics that I think really suit this very well. Number one, the more recent one, is heroic, which gives you buffs when you enchant creatures or play spells that target them. There's also a mechanic called Metalcraft, which I found in a bunch of white soldier creatures, which allows you to have some special interactions when you have a certain number of artifacts on the field. Now, fair warning, I have played this deck as just a mono-white artifact deck, and there are some pretty glaring holes. The RoboCop mechanic does sort of build itself very slowly, so if you kind of fall behind in the early game playing it mono-white, you can sometimes get screwed. So the key here is to mix it with another color. Now I've kind of corresponded each different color to sort of different points in the film. Black will allow you to play sort of an early film OCP executive, sending your soldiers intentionally to the graveyard to bring them back with buffs. Green acts as sort of the building the RoboCop montage. It'll allow you to buff up mana really quick, which will allow you to kind of move your RoboCop onto the field faster. Red builds you kind of like this really aggressive sort of deck, but you're kind of using red as a control element, turning him into the sort of aggressive, vengeance-fueled late movie RoboCop. But I personally really like mixing him with blue, like Jace here. Now, I'm a huge Ravnica fan, and anyone else who likes the entire Ravnica set will know that white-blue is the color of the Azorius Guild, which are the Law and Order people. So, white-blue comes with a lot of really cool Law and Order themed cards, and it also has this nice detention sort of mechanic that is all about suppressing your opponent and keeping him in line and not killing you, which is very useful in a slow building white. So now we've gone over that, we're going to take a look at what's actually in my version of the deck so that you can get an idea of how to build it yourself. Alright, now the key to this deck, as I mentioned, obviously, is your plain white soldier creatures. Now, I personally like both Phalanx Leader and Pure Steel Paladin for this. Phalanx Leader has a nice heroic ability, which means that whenever you cast a spell that targets him, so like your enchantments or your give target creature a +1 and first strike until end of turn, he gets a permanent +1/+1. In my experience, he gets buffed very, very quickly if you play this deck correctly. Now, I also like Pure Steel Paladin because he has this really cool ability called Metalcraft, which means that as long as you have 3 or more artifacts on the field, equipment you control has an equip cost of 0. Now, what's really nice about this is that equipment costs become very, very expensive late in the game, so this really cuts down on those costs. Now, those are not the only 2 cards that work for this. I also like cards like Dauntless River Marshal, which have a sort of tap ability. He gets a +1/+1 if you have an island, and he can tap a target creature with his activated ability. Same with a card like has the Snare Squad, which allows you to tap a target creature whenever you attack. Or just don't even overthink it. Play it with something like Raise the Alarm, which just allows you to summon regular white soldier tokens. They'll work just fine for this. Now I'm going to demonstrate with Pure Steel Paladin because Pure Steel Paladin is also a great sort of tongue-in-cheek description of RoboCop himself. Alright, so now that we have our creature, we can start attaching things to him. So I like giving him some nice RoboCop armor, like Argentum armor. We can give him some boots like Fleet Feather Sandals, which give him flying. We can give him a gun in the form of a Heart Piercer bow, which allows you to do extra damage whenever you attack. A nice robot sword hand, and of course his Ford Taurus, the Chariot of Victory. So all of these kind of give a whole bunch of different buffs, and it's nice because if you end up attaching enough equipment, it becomes sort of redundant. So even if your opponent starts bouncing pieces of equipment back to your hand or destroying them, he's still got the effects that you gave him because two different artifacts give him that effect. And what this means is that even if your opponent tries to fight back with anti-artifact spells or bounce spells, he's going to have to waste those spells throwing away equipment that isn't going to do much. Now on top of equipment, we also have enchantments. So the big one far and away is going to be indestructibility, which does what it says in the label. It gives a target permanent indestructible, which means that it cannot be affected by spells or combat damage that will destroy it. It's interesting to note that indestructibility can also be attached to a permanent. So if you end up having multiple of these in your hand, you can cast one on your creature and one on one of his key pieces of equipment to keep that on the field. There are also some really nice enchantments from the Azorius block, like Righteous Authority, which I just feel seems so RoboCop-y. Also, with the amount of artifacts you have on the field, it might be really cool to have something like an Ensoul Artifact in there, especially because, you know, Ensoul Artifact is basically the entire gist of RoboCop the film. It is giving a soul to an artifact. So I like that. It also can really cheaply help you get a 5/5 onto the field in a pinch, especially if you're drawing a lot of equipment and not a lot of soldiers to attach them to. It just gives you kind of backup. Now when you're playing with this many enchantments and equipment, it's good to have some cards that sort of go with it. So like Brass Squire is a good, nice, cheap creature. He's got 3 toughness, so he's a good defender in a pinch, and he has an ability where if you tap him, you can then attach another piece of equipment to your creature for free. A card like Steel Shaper's Gift would also be very useful, which allows you to search through your deck for an equipment card and put it into your hand. And it's very cheap, so it's good to have a couple of those just in case. If you're not drawing the equipment you need, it's a good way to get it out there. Nice artifact like Ring of 3 Wishes. It's a little expensive, but it gives you 3 chances to search through your library and find a card that you might need. And it's also useful to have cards like Auramancer, which allow you to return enchantment cards from your graveyard to your hand, especially since enchantments are what's going to end up getting thrown away if your opponent starts fighting back. So now for the aggressive side. So white has a lot of enchantments that allow you to be a little more aggressive, like Pin to the Earth, which allows you to remove 6 attack from an opposing creature, things like Banishing Light, which lets you exile opponent creatures, cards like Oppressive Raise, which allow you to enchant an opponent creature, and then he is forced to pay an extra 3 mana just to have him attack or to activate any abilities. White and blue also has some really interesting Law and Order themed instants, like Restore the Peace, which returns each creature that dealt damage that's turned to its owner's hand. Protect and Serve, which feels very RoboCop-y. It's a nice fuse card with a couple different abilities. Swift Justice, which can give you a nice temporary boost if you need it, and really work well with Phalanx Leader because it can give him this heroic ability. Things like Ephemeral Shields, which will give you Indestructible until end of turn. Mortal's Ardor, which gives you 1/1 and lifelink. Or I like this nice old card, Backfire, which deals 1 damage to a target creature's controller for every 1 damage dealt to you. So it gives you a nice sort of defense. Now there are a bunch of different instants and sorceries like that out there. Lots of stuff that works, especially when you're talking about white-blue. So feel free to play around on your own. I would definitely suggest keeping a bunch of removal spells or suppression spells, stuff like Pillar of Light, which can exile creatures, or Divine Verdict, which can destroy a creature that's attacking or blocking, just to kind of keep him on his toes in the early game while you're waiting to get your RoboCop out. So that is essentially the RoboCop deck. Now if you like this deck, I'll be posting a link to the tapped out page below, which will give you a full breakdown of all the cards in it, its mana curve, and all sorts of stuff like that. If you have a different idea of how you build this deck, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you have something else that you'd like to see me try and build a deck around, I'm also taking suggestions. If you really hated this video, just don't watch it anymore. Go away. I'm done with you. Take a look at the tapped out page, build it yourself, let me know how it does in your Legacy tournaments, and I will see you next time.